I'm Inez Stepman.
I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Will Chamberlain.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. So we've got a great lineup for you this week. Amber and I are both going to lead a double segment, I should say, on the Democratic Convention, as that's leading all of the news right now. Then we're going to move to Will. We're going to talk about Waltz as Homer Simpson or as a white minstrel show. And then we're going to move to something that seems like it should be important, but somehow has completely fallen out of the news, which is the forgotten Biden impeachment. And Ben is going to take us through some of that. So I guess this is where I'll kick it to Amber to talk about the convention. And she's coming to us from Chicago, I believe.
That is correct. I am in Chicago at my Airbnb right now. And I guess let's start with a compare and contrast with the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, because I was at that as well. Of course, we covered that on this podcast. And as much as the mainstream media is casting this DNC as, and the Harris Waltz ticket more generally, as a campaign of joy and excitement and love and unity, it's actually anything but that here at the convention. Obviously, just blocks away from the United Center, there have been protesters in the thousands expressing their displeasure with Kamala Harris, Biden, Tim Walz, basically the entire Democratic establishment, describing them as supporting genocide and talking about how Joe Biden's legacy will be the slaughter of Palestinians. You have people holding signs that say "Killer Kamala" and openly harassing people who are attending the convention. Every time I've walked past a protester, they see that I have credentials on to get inside, and they ask me if I'm going inside because I want to listen to genocidal dictators speak, and then I have to inform them that I'm media to get them to leave me alone. And people who are actually delegates have been hiding their credentials or taking alternate routes to get into the convention center so that they don't have to walk past these absolutely crazy people. And then just the energy inside of the security perimeter is nothing like it was at the RNC. People feel very separated, they are isolated to an extent, and people have been talking about how the logistics of it are really horrible. There's one entrance in and out for tens of thousands of people to get in every day, which has been a nightmare in terms of waiting in lines miles long down the side of the United Center. The United Center itself has one entrance basically for media, delegates, attendees, everybody, and so there's this huge bottleneck, and it's basically just been pretty awful. And even the Democrats that I've talked to have admitted that it hasn't been a great convention. And then if we move into what the speeches are actually saying, we've heard just an inordinate amount of lies from pretty much every speaker who's come up about what the Republican agenda is, what Trump wants to do, what he's said and done in the past. Biden repeating the very fine people hoax and the bloodbath hoax. We have the Obamas last night basically making their entire speeches about how horrible Trump is. And it's been notably light on policy proposals from the left. Kamala Harris has released one section of her supposed policy platform on the economy, and it went over like a lead balloon. And so now they've refused to talk about anything else. We actually have surrogates for the campaign going on cable news shows at the convention saying that it is a legitimate strategy for Kamala Harris to not release a policy platform because they trust that the media is going to tell voters what it is Kamala wants to do. And they don't want the Republicans to be able to pick apart their proposals ahead of the election. It's analogous to passing Obamacare so that you know what's in it. Instead of reading it before you actually vote for it. If you look at the breakdown of how many times the speakers have mentioned Trump versus things like economy, inflation, immigration, it's in the hundreds to the tens. So it's very bizarre. It's not like any political rally I've ever seen, as much as they've been talking about the future and their theme nights are about for the people and for the future and for America. The actual content has been anything but about that. It's been basically a redux of 2015 and 2016, where they believe that just casting Trump as the biggest villain to ever live in American history is the way to regain the White House. And maybe it is. I guess we'll see. But you all obviously are watching from home, I assume. So I'd love to hear y'all's perspectives about how it's been going so far.
Sure. This is another form of the cost that the Democrats are having to pay for substituting in a last minute candidate. Like, we don't talk about that a lot, but there's a number of different costs they have to pay. Not having a coherent policy platform, everything being rushed, not thoroughly vetting their VP candidate, and the convention kind of being a mess. And it's not a surprise that the convention is being a mess. 6 weeks ago, this convention was going to be for Joe Biden's reelection. All of a sudden, it's now for completely new candidate Kamala Harris, hope with theoretically a completely new message and a completely new policy platform. So they got to figure that all out in 6 weeks, whereas Republicans knew well in advance. Trump was the presumptive nominee within two primaries. He knocked out everybody but Nikki Haley in Iowa, and then knocked out Nikki Haley in New Hampshire. So, the Republicans had plenty of time to prepare, and the Democrats, they got the benefit of the sugar high of the relief at Joe Biden being gone, but there's all these different costs they're going to have to pay for having to do everything last minute as a result of imposing Harris. And I think I'm not surprised that the decision has been made that they're effectively going to forgo a policy platform. They don't have the time to do it well at all. They don't have the time to, debate ideas thoroughly, to figure out what policies are the best ones to advocate for, to get everybody's reaction to them, to get buy-in from key stakeholders. I talked about this a little bit last week or the week before. And because they don't have this time, they throw out one policy idea and it dies. It's a terrible idea. And they're like, oh, well, we better not do that again. And you combine that with Kamala Harris, who is not good at speaking extemporaneously. She wants to be on a script. She wants to be on a teleprompter. She won't do a press conference. She won't do an interview. So you have basically it's a mismatch. You have a lead candidate who can't speak extemporaneously and a campaign that hasn't had time to prepare what she needs to say. So they're just all that's left is vibes. That's all they have going for them. And really the real experiment here is vibes going to be enough?
Well, and it's worth noting the platform itself basically read like Joe Biden's platform. The literal DNC platform was all about the Biden administration, not about Kamala Harris. And there's a question of, is it because they really are ill-prepared, or do they just think that little of the voting public that they're fine running with what they were trotting out weeks back? They don't feel a need to update it. They don't feel a need to let you know what the agenda is. You have to donate to the candidate and vote for the candidate to find out what the candidate's positions and agenda are actually going to be. Or is it just that the candidate's immaterial and it's just, this is a regime apparatchik, this is a regime figurehead, and it's sort of immaterial who the figurehead is? I don't think that's the case, because Democrats typically have been about, the next vibrant, young, dynamic leader, so-called. But obviously that did change with Joe Biden as the quote-unquote transitional figure. I think if Democrat voters had any pride here, they would realize that the party treats them with such contempt, and obviously way beyond the party, treats the American people with total contempt, that the whole campaign is, let's not expose our candidate to the light of day. Let's have our flacks come out and say what maybe the platform looks like, and on and on. It's really, this is the attack on democracy, obviously, where you don't stand for anything. You're totally not transparent. There's no accountability whatsoever. Harris is running from Joe Biden on the one hand. On the other hand, he's embracing her, trying to during the speech. And maybe that knife in the back will ultimately hurt Kamala Harris. But it's a mess. It's a sham. It's a travesty to watch. It's wholly artificial. But the fact that it just might work might be an even more cataclysmic sort of commentary on where we stand today.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with the phrasing, like the regime versus Trump. I think that was always how this election was going to go, and it almost doesn't matter. People people talk about, the fact that there is, and I agree with what Will said, that there's a certain amount of like sugar rush for just for replacing Joe Biden, because that was so transparently depressing. I think this race would have tightened up even if Joe Biden had stayed on the ticket, because what we saw is basically the media in chaos and the usual coordination of the regime, broadly speaking, fall apart because there was dissension within the top Democratic ranks. Right? It's like when the party the party committee is divided and there are two factions within it. We saw some of that coordination fall apart, but now they're getting back on track, and I think we would have seen this race tighten up either way, honestly. As shocking as it is to think about the fact that somehow the two most consequential, huge stories in our politics, both immediately out of the media within a matter of days. One, of course, the assassination attempt on President Trump. And second, the resignation of Joe Biden in terms of running, but not in terms of the presidency, right? Both of those things. We had Biden speaking at this convention at 11 p.m. on the first night. Not a very dignified ice flow they've shoved him off onto. Not, even just not much mention of Biden at all, really, as far as I can tell. Obama did give him a bit of a shout out, which was funny because by all sort of party intrigue accounts, Obama, the knife is still sticking in Joe Biden's back from Obama pushing him out. So, but did get that mention there. But overall, I guess that does come to the real question, right? Which is, can they run away from Joe Biden's record? In other words, can Kamala Harris separate herself from everything she's ever said before about politics and about policy? Can she separate herself in the Biden administration? Can she not release an alternative platform? And can she run this election purely on regime coordination and vibes that are created by media coverage? And I don't say all this to say like that's not possible. It seems to me that it's eminently possible, and it's a really depressing kind of commentary on where we're at. But that to me is the best way to think about this election. Once again, is the regime versus Trump, and the regime includes a media that is not going to be the mechanism by which any pressure whatsoever is put on Kamala to clarify her positions on things that she's said one thing and then the exact opposite, or to clarify which Kamala Harris we're dealing with, or to clarify her policy positions, or to clarify anything really about her campaign or what she's going to do as president. That pressure that would have otherwise been there from the media, certainly, I mean, of course, if she was a Republican, but even, 5, 10, 15 years ago as a Democrat, even with the favorable coverage, you would still have that kind of pressure. I don't know. Do you guys think, for example, in terms of the debates, I think it's been fashionable to say that debates don't matter. It seems to me they matter a ton in this particular setup of the election if they happen, because they may be the only time in the next 2 months where where Kamala has to actually speak to the American people in a relatively unmediated way. Of course, like there'll be friendly moderators and everything, but she will still have to speak into the camera, not off of a teleprompter, and she'll have to speak to the American people. So, I mean, where do the debates stand in terms of importance in all of this? And do you think they'll actually happen?
I think your calculation is right that they matter a whole lot more than they typically do, because it might be the only opportunity the American people have to hear directly from a potentially unscripted Kamala Harris. And not to mention, they still have this specter of the first debate hanging over the Democratic Party, where Trump literally took out the candidate. So people are going to tune in to see if there's a debate as consequential as that first one. And then on your point about media coverage, I mean, just from what I've observed here, I was watching CNN yesterday while they were doing the roll call votes to officially give Kamala the delegates for the nomination. And CNN had their dutiful reporters down on the floor giving these absolute fluff piece softball interviews to some of the people who were announcing their delegates so that they could practice their speeches which are 2 sentences long, where they say California gives its 200 something delegates to Kamala Harris. And CNN is just putting the microphone in front of their face and saying, yeah, do your line, do your line. And nothing like this happened at the Republican convention. Instead, we saw people going down to the floor and trying to ask these gotcha questions of Donald Trump Jr. And it's absurd. And now we also see movement from the RFK Jr. campaign, where he is now announcing something from an undisclosed location in Phoenix, Arizona on Friday, where Trump is also holding a rally in Phoenix, Arizona on Friday. And there's his running mate, Nicole Shanahan, said this week that they basically reached the conclusion that if they stay in the race, they're going to be taking more votes from Trump now that Kamala is the nominee. And RFK hates Kamala because she's representative of the Democratic establishment and regime that prevented him or tried to prevent him from getting on the ballot as a Democrat. And so it looks like he's going to unite forces with Trump in sort of an anti-regime power couple type of move. So I actually think the Democrats have to be very thoughtful about what it is they're exactly doing here in Chicago, because there's not going to be a post-convention bump with this complete fabricated cotton candy land that the media is trying to portray this as, with no actual substance, and also a potential moment on Friday where RFK immediately takes the air out of the balloon by dropping out and endorsing Trump.
Can I ask you, Amber, what your assessment is of the pushback surrounding, because another word that you haven't heard from this convention floor in addition to Biden is Israel, right? Or Palestine. There's been very obviously coordinated silence on that front. But prior to switching out the candidate, we were looking at a lot of comparisons to 1968, right? To the riots in front of the conventions. And legitimately, I kind of have a bet going on in my own household between my husband and I as to and the question is essentially, how much are the violent street mobs and the kind of groups like Antifa, the pro-Palestine protesters, et cetera, how coordinated are they with the Democratic Party, right? From the higher ups in the Democratic Party. And so far, it seems, even though there are, as you described, protests, it seems like they're more muted than what many people would have expected 3 or 4 weeks ago. But I'm wondering if, from your perspective, is that a media coverage thing because the media doesn't want to recognize it and isn't covering it in the same way? Or is it actually just more akin to a extra large protest on the street rather than something that feels like it's headed to 1968?
I think it's a little bit of both, but I mean, it's worth mentioning that the Democratic Party and the campaign surrogates for Kamala Harris basically instructed the media not to cover the protest outside of the convention. And so if you're a protester and you're in Union Park and you have your big, Jumbotron set up and you're doing your little chants, but no one's really around to hear you, then why would you come out for another day? And we even saw in some instances where there were protesters trying to shove the security barriers down. I mean, there's a double security barrier, so they probably weren't going to get much further past the first one anyway. But you kind of saw that it was like a few people who were doing it. It was actually almost reminiscent of what we saw on January 6th, where there were like a few agitators out front who were pushing the fence down. And then the people behind them just kind of walked in because it was down already. And they were like, okay, I guess we'll follow the crowd. And I didn't really feel the appetite, besides the harassment from the protesters, to get particularly violent. It did not feel, for example, like what we saw in the summer of 2020. It didn't feel like even the DC anti-Israel protests that we saw just a few months ago. And I think it's probably because the people here still feel, as much as they proclaim otherwise, some kind of fealty to the Democratic Party.
Yeah, I think that the main takeaway ought to be, and we've seen obviously all the follow the money reporting, which shows that it's essentially the progressive billionaires who are behind the pro-jihadist agitators, and obviously the entire panoply of intersectionally aligned groups, that at the end of the day, as out of control as they may act, they are disciplined when it comes to winning or losing elections. the radicalism and the riots and the violence serve their purpose in 2020, they would be detrimental to the overall cause in 2024, especially when Kamala is doing everything she can to go even more extreme than Joe Biden, incurring favor, for example, with the pro-Hamas wing of the party. So consequently, it seems
Ben, you
that
mean the
they
very
are
fine
disciplined.
people who have a point?
Right. I mean, it seems that they're disciplined at the end of the day. They still fall in line. They all get behind the party, and the party controls and rules all. And the only question would be then when the campuses open back up in September, if the situation in the Middle East explodes, let's say you have something much more aggressive between Iran, its proxies, and Israel, then are they not able to keep the comrades in line? I guess we'll have to see.
Yeah, I get the sense that they, as much as they want the Democratic policy position to change quite radically on its posture toward Israel, they don't want to do that to the point that it harms the party. And I think it's a different calculation now because when Biden was the nominee, I think there was kind of a universal recognition that the Democrats were going to lose in November, especially post debate. So it wasn't really, they weren't harming the party beyond where it was already pretty crippled. And so there wasn't as much at stake for them to be voting uncommitted or to be doing these really radical protests. Now they feel that there's hope that the Democratic Party can win with Kamala. The polls are pretty tight. And so the stakes are a little bit higher. Like, okay, if we do actually have 20,000 people at the DNC causing absolute chaos and mob violence, maybe that bumps us down in the polls 3 points. And then we've actually hurt the people that are our likeliest ally to be on the pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas side.
If nobody else has anything to add about the convention itself, we're going to turn to Will and the topic of the vice presidential pick, and Tim Waltz and what he represents in terms of demographics for both parties.
So yeah, Jack Posobiec had a great tweet on this, essentially comparing Tim Waltz to sort of white minstrel show. And he's also pointed out that the Democrats aren't really offering anything to men. And I've seen some weird articles on like The Hill that, Tim Waltz is the guy who's going to bring young men back into the fold. I think there was a Hill op-ed to that effect. And I think it just, Democrats don't really understand what it is he represents. He represents the Homer Simpson version of white men in America. The white man as an object of mockery, as someone who is deeply submissive and elevating someone else, and is as sort of their almost fantasy, the fantasy of what they wish white men would be, right? The completely useless, supine, submissive white man. And it's also, his behavior is just bizarre. Like you look at him waltzing out onto the stage, literally, and he's just doing all sorts of bizarre hand gestures and clapping, overly energetic, just a very, very strange guy who's deeply non-masculine. And I think that there's something, it connects to the broader theme of the Democratic Party. And it's something I've thought about a lot when just driving around, is that why on earth would I ever consider voting for the Democratic Party when they are so obviously and clearly hostile to my interests due to my immutable characteristics? They are deeply hostile to white people. They are deeply hostile to men. They are deeply hostile to straight people. It's the nature of their politics. I mean, you even look at what is their economic policy. They're thinking, wealth transfers, seizures of money. Where's that money going to go? Clearly to their pet ideological projects. And so it becomes a way in which they like it. And so Tim Waltz ends up being the manifestation of that ideology, which is the white man that they're embarrassing and humiliating and taking something from. And I mean, first off, I'm just offended by it as a general rule. I mean, I'm more offended by this Democratic campaign than I am by most. But I think the second thing is that I don't think it's going to be good for them electorally. I think that this is among many other problems that the Harris campaign faces, namely being deeply, deeply undemocratic in the small d sense. No press conferences, no questions, no primary votes, no nothing, no policy platform. But it's also just a deeply campaign. If it has any message, it's like, if you're a straight white guy your job is to submit to us. And I don't understand why anybody would want to vote for that.
Yeah, I mean, if you could boil down the message that I think this sends, and it was visible in the few, sort of shots of the convention floor and in the speaker lineup. Um, First of all, this is a women's party, right? I don't know, Amber, if you can chime in as you see walking
It
around.
looks like a teachers union conference.
Yeah,
and
it is.
With all sincerity, it looks like Randy Weingarten got cloned a million times, and some of them dyed their hair purple, and everybody's at the DNC. Yes.
No relation, if I haven't said it on this podcast before, in any way, shape, or form.
But yeah, it's visible in the speaker lineup and in the shots of the convention themselves that this is a women's party, and it seems like with even the use of the word dudes, white dudes for Harris, right? Because white men might be a little too dignified or even perceived on that side of the aisle in the politics that they do as aggressive or oppressive, right? White dudes for Harris, and represented by Waltz himself. It seems like the pitch they're giving is extending the hand to white men who have been demonized by identity politics of the left as the primary villain, right? The primary oppressor. The hand extended is, you can be a joke rather than a villain if you'd like to be. Like, you can come on in and we'll just laugh at you with this kind of cutesy commercial style stereotype of, not eating spicy tacos or whatever it is. And you can be harmless and a joke rather than be the primary target. If you don't come on in and you don't acquiesce to our politics, then you're dangerous, fascist, racist, all the things they call Trump. But if you come on in, then we'll just laugh at you. That doesn't seem to me to be a really, electorally, I agree with Will. I mean, they do actually need some percentage of men to vote for the Democratic Party. And particularly, they do need some percentage of white men to vote for the Democratic Party. But even beyond the racial aspect of this, I think the gendered sense of these two campaigns is probably broader and more sharp than any election that I can remember, right? Where I think there's a huge opportunity for the Republican Party to solidify a very solid majority of men in the country merely by not demonizing or laughing at them. And unfortunately, I feel like we focus, and I said this when we were talking about the Vance childless cat lady comments. Unfortunately, the framing is always that 2012 autopsy report, right? It's always, how can the Republican Party appeal to demographics that it's weak in, right? So, like, how do we appeal to unmarried childless women who are overwhelmingly voting Democrat? How do we make inroads into that voting demographic? And I'm not saying that's a useless, you do want to run it, you want to get every vote you can get, right? If people are persuadable. But it seems to me that the Republican Party is leaving on the table any potential to run up the score in a male voting demographic that is being actively rejected and ejected from the Democratic Party. And to me, it seems like that would be an enormous political opportunity that would at least garner equal attention as, how do we convert essentially women who are unmarried and childless, and therefore demographically, exceptions aside, quite hostile to our messages.
I guess the question would be, how do you seize upon this? And part of this is, well, first of all, I do think it is worth saying, of course, the first rule of the regime is everything they say is projection. This is the weirdest candidate of the candidates. Not only that, of course, but a shill for the Chinese Communist Party and someone who lies about things big and small, including when there's almost no benefit to doing so. For example, with the whole IVF issue. I think to Will's point, he is the ideal man from the perspective of the Democrat Party, which I think really speaks volumes. The white dudes for Kamala thing is cringe identitarianism. This is appealing to the progressives. There's no way this appeals to any man in this country. So I guess considering all that, how do you seize upon it? At the end of the day, what can you do to win over the cohort for which the Democrats are showing so much contempt here. Of course, on top of the fact that they have the contempt for women qua women when it comes to the sports. Put all that together. I mean, you should be winning and running up the score on a whole slew of different demographics. But how do you guys think you break through when you have obviously a regime engaging in a massive information warfare effort?
What's so disturbing about Tim Walls's self-degradation as well is that he is such a dishonest person. I mean, this week, the big story is that he deliberately misled numerous people, including traditional mainstream media outlets that have had to correct headlines because of this, with the idea that his wife had gotten IVF treatments and used that as a line of attack against the supposed Republican effort to ban IVF, which is hardly real anyway. But it turns out his wife used a far less invasive and more popular form of fertility treatment that is essentially artificial insemination, which has nothing to do with pro-life objections to IVF because it doesn't create embryos that will then be destroyed. And this is on top of the stolen valor, the weird lies about whether or not he seasons his tacos or his food as a white guy. So, I mean, when you combine these consistent, weird, petty lies with him bowing in the face of the DEI party, I mean, the collective effect of it is just this shell of a human being that is so disturbing to watch. He's like one of those blow up things outside of a car dealership, going like this in front of Kamala Harris to look non-threatening, and it's like, as the kids would say, gives me the ick.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of like summing it up. And I think, Waltz is just such a weak candidate. It really is. I think he's yet another example of what I talked about earlier, the idea of Democrats are paying the cost of substituting in their candidate last minute. And it's a lot of different ways in which they're paying the cost. One of them is that they have a really, really mediocre VP candidate. And I think that, they chose this guy because he does fit their sort of ideological preconceptions of what a white man should be in their party. But they really clearly didn't think as hard as they probably wanted to. And really, I'm sure they didn't want to step in it on stolen valor stuff, for example.
Yeah, I'm with Amber. It's an extremely weird thing to lie about, not to overuse the word weird, using IUI versus IVF. I guess it makes sense in a weird political calculation. Like, you want to tell a personal story to say, oh, my family wouldn't exist but for this technology. But it is a very like weird and personal thing to lie about. With that, I think we'll go to our fourth segment with Ben to talk about the long forgotten attempts to impeach Biden, who, lest anyone forget, is in fact still president of the United States.
Yeah, the presidency is a total afterthought, and it's just treated as totally normal now that you have, at best, a Woodrow Wilson equivalent Edith Wilson situation. Although in this case, I guess maybe, yes, Joe Biden obviously has disproportionate sway, but it's really all the Obamaites standing in for the Edith Wilson role here. Then there is the fact that we had this large House impeachment report, which you want to talk about receipts, and Democrats talked about where are the receipts. Endless receipts of the Biden family's international influence peddling scheme to the tune of tens of millions of dollars from our adversaries, as we've talked about before, laundered through dozens of shell companies, and in which Joe Biden, and this may be the most important part of the report on the merits and the substance of it, Joe Biden is the closer or the clincher, responsible ultimately for all. He is what is monetized. He shows his face with a wink and a nod at every single turn of the Biden family's influence peddling, and he engages in policy changes, modifications, exercises his authority as vice president, to push in a direction favorable to Hunter Biden and the Biden family's clients. He lies about it. Then the administration obstructs the impeachment inquiry, the DOJ and beyond, in sabotaging the investigation into Hunter Biden and completely insulating Joe Biden from investigation. They end up running part of the cover-up as well associated with this. And on the merits, you have damning evidence of impeachable conduct. And that is actually the conclusion that the three House committees that led this inquiry come to, is that they're still investigating. They're still going through interviewing witnesses and such, but they have substantial evidence that impeachable conduct was executed. They note that the precedents were set in certain instances under the impeachments of Donald Trump for the grounds of an impeachment of Joe Biden. They talk about, among the other conclusions, that Joe Biden engaged in abuse of power, engaged in foreign entanglements, corruption, and obstructions of investigations, rising to the level of quote unquote impeachable conduct. The amazing thing about this, of course, is that this isn't even an afterthought in the news cycle. It's nothing, essentially. For the Democrats, they marginalized it from the start, said there's no there, et cetera. Selling out of the country to the Chinese, the Russians, Ukrainians, the Kazakhs, the Romanians, and on, meaningless, even though it's exactly, of course, what they accuse their opponents of. And here you have chapter and verse, the evidence of it, classic corruption, cronyism, entanglements with foreign adversaries, no question ever asked, obviously, by the Democrats or the media, to what extent did these millions of dollars impact policy then and impact policy today? From the Republican side, this basically, once Joe Biden took himself out, essentially, and even while he was sagging in the polls, I think they viewed it as not beneficial politically to vote on impeachment to the extent they had the votes in the House, and obviously would go nowhere in the Senate. On the merits, it's good, in my view, that they have it on record that the precedent was set with Trump. But if you can't even impeach the guy, and I'm not sure that they're necessarily going to even hold the vote at the end of the day, that's sad. And it shows that one side has successfully weaponized it and the other side can't even rally its troops behind it. Now, again, it's a political remedy, and that's clearly the calculation they've made. But at the end of the day, basically what we're saying as a country is that these corrupt acts are totally acceptable and going to be treated as above board, but they can continue to invent sham impeachments and try and sabotage, subvert, and destroy the other side. So that's a sad state of play. An additional leg of this sad state of play, and I wrote about this at the Federalist this week, is that quietly Hunter Biden and the very government agencies that the IRS whistleblowers exposed as having tanked the investigation and prosecution of the Bidens, they're jointly working effectively to punish the IRS whistleblowers in a case that Hunter Biden brought against the IRS, brought the case against the IRS, claiming that the whistleblowers in the IRS engaged in unlawful conduct, making unauthorized disclosures of confidential tax information, bogus charges, as even the DOJ itself admits in responsive filings, but they put it in a footnote. They don't call on the court to dismiss the case in toto. So basically, these charges against the whistleblowers are still hanging out there over their heads. The whistleblowers themselves want to join the case and intervene and defend themselves, not have the agencies they blew the whistle on and who they say engaged in reprisals against them, not have those agencies defend them. They want to defend themselves. And both Hunter Biden's side and the U.S. government are trying to prevent them from intervening in the case. So all around, the regime protects itself. Doesn't appear that the Bidens will face any justice, with the exception of being knifed down the stretch run of the 2024 election. There will be likely no impeachment. Certainly, I imagine zero prosecution after the fact. And the whistleblowers have the threat of the entire regime coming down on their head at any time, and including through this case, where the U.S. government and Hunter Biden, who are supposed to be on opposite sides, are still dangling over the heads of the whistleblowers discovery and wrecking their lives over a case that should have never been brought. That's totally frivolous. So with all that said, I put it out to the group, what do you make of the forgotten impeachment, the ignored impeachment, essentially, and what the long run consequences are for how this is all played out?
Well, I mean, it does raise the question, Ben, whether there'll be any consequences whatsoever for any of this behavior, even if Trump wins, right? Because the political incentive to actually, and this isn't even a matter of revenge, it would just be to actually investigate and prosecute what is obviously sitting there waiting to be investigated and prosecuted, whether the incentive will be there now that Joe Biden has essentially, again, put on, not even a very classy ice floe, right? The fact that his political career is over, it just makes it more difficult to politically to drum up the necessary sort of political capital to do this. But that leaves the question of, will there be any justice? I mean, potentially this is one of the most biggest scandals in American history, to have a sitting vice president, his influence being sold to America's enemies for personal corrupt gain by himself and his family. That is a huge political scandal. And obviously like one worthy of prosecution. The other thing that this brings up, just the fact that, and Jarrett, my husband, has a good piece about this in the Daily Signal this week, but it really has laid bare. I know all of our listeners probably have heard us talk about this before and know it themselves, but the way that our country is governed by the executive branch, by the administrative state, by the deep state, whatever you want to call it, right? The extent to which the presidency has become ceremonial, or a figurehead, or a kind of award on the capstone of a very useful political career, rather than an actual dynamic office in terms of setting policy or actually driving the country. And I don't want to overstate this. Obviously, there are still decisions the president is supposed to make, like those decisions with regard to war and peace in the immediate, short-term context. And those are exactly the sort of decisions that we worry about in the next couple months, while Joe Biden is clearly not performing, is not actually, performing the opposite of a president anymore. But overall, this just makes it really clear, in the same way that the debate made it clear that Joe Biden was not mentally competent for the job. It seems to me that the way he's been treated since his name has been taken off the race, right, in 2024, despite the fact that he is still the sitting president, lays bare the fact that we may be run by, in an era of the sort of ascendancy of the executive branch. Congress barely does anything anymore, right? But we are not in the era of the presidency, because the presidential office seems to have minimal control at best of where the ship of state is going. And instead, those decisions are being made largely by essentially a cabal of bureaucrats, of high-ranking bureaucrats, with or without advisement from the outside, from people like Obama, right? So our government is operating as essentially a bureaucratic oligarchy without any democratic check, whether that's from Congress or the president. And it seems like really obvious now that we're looking at Joe Biden after this debate and after coming off the race, and nobody is pretending that the major issues and decisions in this country are running through Joe Biden anymore.
Yeah, I'm not surprised by this. I think that the Republicans are right not to push harder in terms of getting Biden out. But because I think this would have been a lot more relevant in a world where Biden had actually, Biden was still the candidate. But now that he's not, I understand why they're not pushing it. But yeah, I mean, probably not going to be justice, and sometimes there just isn't justice. But I mean, he never should have been president in the first place. His son should have, he should have made sure that his son didn't go work for that Ukrainian oil and gas company. Ridiculous that this even happened.
Yeah, I think that's the sticking point, is although the case in terms of tying Joe Biden to the financial payouts is circumstantial, it doesn't mean it's not legitimate, right? I mean, cases are decided on circumstantial evidence all the time, but I was actually just watching the Scott Peterson documentary, so kind of a good comparison, I guess. But even so, I mean, the idea that Joe Biden, at the very least, would not be wise enough to direct his son to stay out of foreign business while he's in office is just so outrageously stupid.
And on that note, we're going to go ahead and move to final thoughts. If anyone has anything to offer about the convention, about anything else we talked about, or about topics we weren't able to put in the first 4 seconds.
I don't necessarily have something deeply thought out about this, but I would just point everyone to Matt Taibbi's piece on this quote unquote freedom frame that the Democrats are using in this election. Beyond the joy and vibes, of course, the Democrats are recasting tyranny as freedom and trying to essentially steal a concept from conservatives and others on the right and reframe their entire agenda, which, of course, requires coercion, requires plunder, requires eviscerating every single right in the Bill of Rights. They're trying to reframe that as freedom. And obviously, this starts with abortion, and then it goes on to a slew of other issues as well. It's a nefarious play. It's the height of cynicism, obviously. But when they're dedicated to a narrative, a theme, the propaganda around it usually ends up, or at least historically has ended up pretty good. I mean, now some of it is cringe, and maybe they're just appealing to themselves and balkanizing. But at the end of the day, this is one of the more cynical propagandistic efforts, I think, to arise from the left in some time, which is really saying something. And I think Taibbi, as someone at least formerly of the left, has really good insights on it. So I'd urge everyone to check out the piece on the freedom frame.
Yeah. My final thought is sort of on the small, I hinted at this earlier, but the fact that what Kamala Harris is running is like the least small d Democratic campaign in modern history. Because what is the whole idea of democratic discourse and the idea that it generates? Well, it's supposed to generate people who are good on their feet, capable of speaking extemporaneously, and capable of handling challenges that are thrown at them. It demonstrates they have like popular support in a meaningful way, and that they're examined. You put yourself up for examination and you reveal yourself to the public, and you don't do anything you're not doing everything behind closed doors. And the Democratic campaign doesn't allow her to speak in public, or she rather has decided she's not going to have any press conferences. She's not going to sit for any interviews. She's not going to have a policy platform, and she hasn't gotten a primary vote. And the combination of those things, and then what is the strategy? The strategy is the overwhelming force of the mainstream media lining up behind her and just forcing positive vibes about her down the throats of Americans. And then hoping that works. And it's like, even if that works, is that democratic in a meaningful way? That's just, that's classic. I forget the guy who wrote Public Opinion, but it's like some guy from the 20s or something. But it feels like Edward Bernays, the ultimate, like, this is the propaganda campaign. This is the media deciding we like this candidate, the candidate themselves doing nothing to reveal anything about themselves to the public, and the power of a consolidated media apparatus and all of its reach just forcing this candidate down our throats. And I compare that to somebody like Trump, who did this really fascinating podcast interview with Theo Vaughn, where they're talking about addiction and all these interesting things. And it's clear, like, the guy's actually participating in the Democratic process in a small d way. He's meeting people, having conversations, talking, and letting himself be examined and be questioned. And I think that's really important. And it's yet another reason I can't stand the Democrats and the Harris campaign.
And he's even just being human, which is something that has been missing in politics for a long time. I think that's a good analysis. Well, my final thoughts I'll use to plug my feature article in the September edition of the Spectator Mag, titled "What Did Kamala Actually Do to Address the Root Causes of Migration?" And it's a piece that accepts the premise, which is a false premise, from the left, that Kamala was never really border czar, that she was only in charge of this very specific subset of policy within immigration, which was to address root causes of migration from the Northern Triangle countries. And it actually breaks down the statistics involving the number of people who have come from those countries from when Kamala was given that position in 2021 to the numbers in 2023. And it's quite clear that even if you retcon the fact that she was obviously the border czar and in charge of reducing illegal immigration, even on that smaller subset, she failed quite miserably. So I think it's worth a read just to get the actual numbers. So when I went through it, the Democrats have claimed that she decreased Northern Triangle crossings from 44% of all crossings to 22% of all crossings. But when you put that in the context of the larger overall increase in illegal crossings, Northern Triangle country crossings only fell 5% between 21 and 23. And then meanwhile, they were up over 140% from where they were during the Trump administration. So again, you can read it at thespectator.com about Kamala's supposed work on the border.
Yeah, my final thought is on Title IX, the ongoing battles and over the Biden regulations that first redefine sex to include gender identity with all of the consequences attendant to that. Second, strip due process protections in college campuses. Third, seriously impinge on what the courts have said as protected First Amendment speech, especially with regard to pronouns, but also with regard to a stretched definition of quote unquote harassment that stretches it beyond what we think of as, a guy following a woman around and whistling or something like that, but just statements, even generalized statements, for example, about the state of the sexes or the war between the sexes, about feminism and a lot of other things. So these are protected speech that will be under the gun from K-12 all the way up through college campuses if these regs are allowed to stand. Right now, there's a network, kind of patchwork of injunctions against those regulations for being way beyond their skis in terms of being really far from the text itself of Title IX and being invented entirely by Biden bureaucrats. I guess I should say Biden-Harris bureaucrats at this point. But so there was an appeal to the Supreme Court to drop some of those injunctions. That appeal was sent back down, meaning 5 justices think that there is merit to putting in an injunction, which indicates a little bit what they might think about the merits of the question. I do think that we have a Supreme Court that's more skeptical broadly of agency power, and that's going to clash in interesting ways. In the way that, like what we described in the Biden segment about the fact that essentially the presidency is kind of ceremonial and that the executive branch really does run the country. One of the things that could throw a wrench in all of that is a Supreme Court that is aggressive in saying, like, no, actually, if you want to do these things, you have to go and change the law through Congress. You can't just independently with executive power go ahead and change and rearrange, and in this case, completely upend the legislative text of civil rights law in this country. So that's something to watch. There was like I said, it was 5-4. Gorsuch sided with the liberals on this, just like he sided in Bostock. I think this is actually, we'll defend him a little bit here. I don't think it's because of policy considerations. I think he really is dedicated to a textualist reading that I think is wonky and not supported by the legislative history, but I can understand where he's getting there. But for the purposes of anything regarding, quote, discrimination on the basis of sex, whether Title VII or Title IX, Bostock is just, and this case, this not really case, but just kicking down the injunction, indicates that Gorsuch is, for all intents and purposes, on the left for even though his reasoning is very different. But that's still, at the end of the day, something that we should keep in mind for all future cases regarding discrimination on the basis of sex and the Civil Rights Act. So a case worth keeping an eye on as we go forward, and I'm sure we'll be part of the campaign to the extent that we have any discussion of any policy or actual consequences in the campaign. So with that does it for us this week. We'll see you next week. On behalf of Amber, Ben, and Will, thanks for tuning in. I'm Inez Stepman, and we'll see you at the next NatCon Squad.